The watch was still ticking. Ella Norris stood in the doorway of her farmhouse with a shotgun leveled at the chest of the man on her porch, and she could hear it, the faint, rhythmic heartbeat of her father's pocket watch, the one that had been buried with him 6 weeks ago, the one that was now resting in the outstretched palm of the most dangerous-looking man she had ever seen in her 24 years of living. "Where did you get that?" Her voice did not shake. She had promised herself it would not shake. But her knees were doing something she had no control over, and the barrel of the shotgun dipped just slightly before she forced it back up. The man on her porch did not flinch at the gun. That alone told her something dark and unsettling about who he was. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with 3 days of riding written into every line of his face, the cracked lips, the sunburned skin at the back of his neck, the dust that had worked its way into the creases of his leather coat. His eyes were a gray-green color, like a sky before a tornado. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not threat. It was not guilt. It was something quieter than either of those things, and somehow that made it worse. "It belonged to your father," he said. His voice was low, the kind of low that came from a man who had learned to keep his words close to his chest. "My name is Harvey Ashford. I rode 3 days to return it to you." The name hit her like a stone thrown at glass. Harvey Ashford. She had heard that name in whispers across 3 counties. Harvey Ashford, who had ridden with the Coburn Gang until the Coburn Gang stopped existing. Harvey Ashford, who had robbed the Federal Mail train outside of Tucson 2 years back and disappeared into the desert like smoke. Harvey Ashford, who some said was dead and others said was something worse. "You rode with the men who killed my father," Ella said, and this time her voice did shake, but not from fear. It shook from the very specific violence of grief that only emerges when you are standing in front of the thing that caused it. "No," Harvey said, and he said it with the weight of a man who understood that the word was not going to be enough. "But I rode with the man who did." She should have fired. She knew that. Her neighbor, Cleet Parsons, would have told her to fire. The circuit judge would have told her to fire. The wanted poster tacked to the wall of the marshal's office in Redemption, Texas, with Harvey Ashford's face printed in rough black ink and a number underneath that represented $500, would have absolutely told her to fire. She did not fire. "Then you had better start talking," she said, "before I change my mind about the order of things." He talked. And the world Ella Norris thought she understood split open like dry earth after a long rain. 6 weeks earlier, before any of this, before the watch and the man on the porch and the secrets that were about to rearrange her entire life, Ella had been managing a farm alone on the edge of the Pecos River Basin in southwest Texas in the year 1882. Her father, Robert Norris, had been a practical man. He had come to Texas from Tennessee in 1861 with 2 mules, a Bible, and the kind of stubbornness that the frontier required but occasionally punished. He had built the farmhouse with his own hands, married a woman from a Spanish land-grant family named Maria Castillo, who had died of fever when Ella was 11, and then he had raised Ella alone with the same practical stubbornness that had defined everything else about him. The watch had been his one concession to sentiment. It was a gold-cased Hamilton Railroad watch, engraved on the back with the initials RN and a date, September 12, 1861, the day he arrived in Texas. He wound it every morning, and he consulted it more than was strictly necessary for a man farming the land. But Ella had always understood that the watch was his way of keeping time anchored, of keeping himself anchored. He had died on a Wednesday in late September. She had found him in the south pasture with a bullet wound in his chest and his horse gone and his pockets turned out. The men of Redemption had told her it was a robbery, a terrible, random act of frontier violence. They had buried him without the watch because by then it was already gone. She had grieved in the way that people grieve when they do not have the luxury of stopping. She had kept working the farm. She had negotiated with the grain merchant in town. She had fixed the fence along the creek that had needed fixing for 3 months, and that her father had always meant to get to. She had cried exactly twice, both times at night, both times with her face pressed into her pillow so that no one would hear. And then, 6 weeks after the burial, a man who was wanted in 3 states arrived at her front door carrying a dead man's watch. Harvey Ashford had not always been what the wanted posters said he was. He had grown up in Missouri, the younger son of a blacksmith, in a town that was poor enough to make a young man look for alternatives and lawless enough to make those alternatives easy to find. He had fallen into the Coburn gang at the age of 20 through a combination of bad luck and worse judgment, and he had stayed with them for 4 years through a combination of fear and the particular paralysis that comes from being already too deep in something dark to see the way back to the light. Dale Coburn, the man who led the gang, was the kind of man who created loyalty through terror, who kept his people close by making certain they understood exactly what would happen if they tried to leave. Harvey had seen what happened to the men who tried to leave, and so he had stayed, and he had ridden, and he had done things he was not proud of, and he had tried to tell himself that lines he had not personally crossed still made him something other than what he was. The robbery of Robert Norris had not been planned. That was the part Harvey needed Ella to understand, though he knew how insufficient that was as a thing to offer her. They had been moving through the area following a tip about a payroll delivery that turned out to be false, and Dale Coburn had spotted Robert Norris riding alone in the pasture, with the kind of watchful, evaluating look that Coburn reserved for opportunity. Harvey had watched from the ridge. He had not ridden down with Dale and the others. He had told himself that this too was a line he would not cross. But he had watched, and when the shot came, when Robert Norris's horse bolted and the man himself dropped from the saddle into the dry grass, Harvey Ashford had done nothing but sit on his horse on the ridge and feel something inside himself go cold and still in a way that it had never fully recovered from. Dale had come back with a handful of dollars and the gold pocket watch. He had been cheerful about it, which was the worst part. He had flipped the watch in the air and caught it and made a joke about keeping better time, and Harvey had looked at the watch glinting in the afternoon sun and had understood in a way that he had never quite allowed himself to understand before that he had become a person he did not want to be. He left the gang 3 days later, which was not as simple as it sounded. It required careful preparation and more than a little fear, and it ended with Harvey riding hard into the desert with Dale Coburn's voice echoing across the flats behind him, with a promise that the word Harvey would use later in quieter moments was a vow, not a threat, but a vow. The kind of promise men like Dale kept, eventually, if you gave them the opportunity. But Harvey had ridden anyway, because there are moments when a person decides who they are going to be regardless of what the consequences of that decision might cost them, and that was Harvey Ashford's moment. He had ridden north with the watch in his coat pocket, and he had spent 2 weeks finding out who the watch belonged to, and then he had ridden south again toward the Pecos River Basin and the farmhouse and the woman with the shotgun. He told Ella all of this standing on her porch, with the gun still more or less trained on him and the afternoon light going orange and low across the Texas scrubland. And when he finished talking, the silence between them had a texture to it like something that could be touched. "You watched," Ella said. She was not asking. "Yes," Harvey said. He did not qualify it, which she found herself noting in spite of everything. "And you did nothing." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at the watch, which he was still holding out to her, and she thought about her father winding it every morning, and she thought about how much she hated this man, and she thought about how much the hate and the grief had become so tangled together over the last 6 weeks that she could not always tell where one ended and the other began. "Why did you ride 3 days?" she asked. "The law would reward you for that watch. There's not a marshal between here and El Paso who wouldn't give you safe conduct for a week if you came in with information about the Coburn gang." "I didn't do this for safe conduct," Harvey said. "Then why?" He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she thought she saw something in them that she did not entirely trust herself to interpret. "Because it was the right thing," he said. Because there aren't enough right things left in my life to afford to skip the ones that present themselves. It was not a romantic thing to say. It was not a charming thing to say. It was entirely unadorned and completely direct, and Ella Norris, who had been raised by a practical man who distrusted ornamentation in all its forms, found it to be the most persuasive thing she had heard in a very long time. She lowered the shotgun. "I was about to make supper," she said, and she surprised herself by saying it. "You look like you haven't eaten properly in days." "3 days," Harvey confirmed. "Then you had better come inside." He hesitated at the threshold of the door in a way that she noticed and found, against her will, meaningful, like a man who understood the weight of entering a space he had not been invited into without conditions, like a man who was accustomed to taking and not accustomed to being given. "I appreciate that," he said. "Don't," Ella said. "Not yet. Come inside and eat, and then we can decide what we appreciate." Supper was corn mush with salt pork and the last of the late-season beans from the garden, which was a modest meal by any standard and more modest than Ella would have preferred to offer a guest, which was a thought she immediately caught herself having and examined with considerable suspicion. She had no reason to want to impress this man. She had approximately 500 reasons not to, and they were printed on paper in the marshal's office in town. But she set 2 plates anyway, and she set the watch on the table between them where they could both see it, and she sat across from Harvey Ashford and watched him eat with the controlled, careful manners of a man who was trying not to reveal how hungry he was. He noticed her watching him and he stopped himself and set down his fork. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For being the kind of man who arrives at your door the way I arrived." "You mean with my father's watch?" "I mean being the kind of man who was there that day and did nothing." Ella looked at her own plate. She thought about saying that she forgave him, because she had been raised by her father with a certain understanding of the practical utility of forgiveness, the idea that you forgave people not for their sake but for your own, so that the anger did not become a thing you carried until it wore grooves in you. But the truth was she was not sure she was ready to forgive him yet, and she was practical enough herself to understand that pretending otherwise would only muddy the water. "Eat your supper," she said instead. "We can talk about what you are and are not sorry for when you're not 3 days hungry." Something in his expression shifted then. Something that was almost a smile, though he caught it before it fully formed. She caught it too, that almost smile, and it did something small and traitorous to her chest that she decided to think about later and not now. They ate in silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, but something in between, a silence that was in the process of becoming something, though neither of them could have said exactly what. After supper, Harvey stood up to leave. He had his hat in his hands, and he was looking at her with an expression that was clearly preparing to say thank you and goodbye. And Ella said, without planning to, "It's late. There are 3 hours of dark riding before you'd reach town, and the Coburn gang isn't something you want to encounter in the dark. The barn is clean and there's a loft." He looked at her. She could see him calculating the offer from several angles at once. She respected that he was doing this, that he was not simply accepting without understanding what he was accepting. "You are certain," he said. "My father would not have sent a man back out into the night after feeding him supper," Ella said. "That's not the kind of house this is." He nodded once. "Then I'm grateful," he said, "just for tonight." Just for tonight was the first thing either of them said that would later prove to be entirely wrong. Harvey woke before dawn in the barn loft and lay in the hay listening to the sounds of the farm, the horses shifting below him, the creak of the house in the wind, the distant yip of a coyote somewhere in the scrubland to the east. He had slept better than he had slept in months, which troubled him a little, because he was not a man who slept easily, and the fact that he had done it in this particular place seemed significant in a way he was not yet prepared to examine. He went to the creek to wash before the sun was fully up, and he was standing there in the gray pre-dawn light, his shirt off and the cold water bringing him sharply awake, when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Ella Norris walking toward the creek with 2 buckets for the morning water. She stopped when she saw him. He stopped. The light was exactly that specific shade of deep gray blue that the desert turns in the last minutes before dawn, and in that light, with the water running cold and clear over the stones, they looked at each other for a moment that lasted about 3 heartbeats longer than it should have. "I didn't think you'd be up yet," Ella said. "I don't sleep much past first light," Harvey said. He reached for his shirt. "The water's clean," Ella said, gesturing at the creek. "My father built a diversion ditch 2 years back. Good water." "I noticed." He pulled his shirt on. "Can I help with those?" She looked at the buckets. She was clearly the kind of woman who did not easily accept help, and he could see her deciding whether this particular instance was one she was willing to make an exception for. "You can carry one," she said. He carried one. They walked back to the house in the early morning quiet, and Harvey thought about the last time he had done something as ordinary and domestic as carrying a bucket of water beside a woman in the morning, and he realized he could not remember a time. His life had not been organized around ordinary and domestic things. "What are your plans?" Ella asked as she set her bucket down beside the door. "I hadn't made any," Harvey said honestly. "I had the one plan, which was to return the watch. Past that I hadn't thought clearly. The law is still looking for you," Ella said. "Coburn's gang or not, you've got a record." "I know." "There's a marshal comes through redemption every 2 weeks," she said. "He was here 3 days ago, so you've got 11 days before he's back, roughly." "Why are you telling me that?" Ella looked at him. The sun was breaking over the horizon now, and the light hit the farmhouse and the dry grass and the distant line of the Picos and turned everything gold for a few minutes. "Because," she said carefully, "I have not yet decided what I think about you, and I would prefer not to have that decision made for me by a man with a badge." Harvey looked at her in the golden morning light and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something that resembled, distantly, the particular hope that people carry before the world has removed it from them. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not sound like too much. "There's a fence post down on the south side of the creek pasture," Ella said, turning back toward the door. "It's been down 3 days and the cattle are using it as an opportunity. If you're going to eat breakfast in this house, you can earn it fixing the fence." She said it matter-of-factly and walked inside, and Harvey Ashford stood in the morning light and looked at the farm around him, the patched-up barn, the neat rows of the kitchen garden, the fence lines that ran out across the flat land toward the horizon, and felt something settle in him that he did not have an adequate word for. He fixed the fence. It was not the last fence he fixed. Over the following days, in a process that was gradual enough that neither of them could have identified the exact moment at which it became an understood thing rather than a day-by-day arrangement, Harvey Ashford stayed on at the Norris farm. He slept in the loft. He woke before dawn. He worked. There was always work on a farm in 1882, always something broken or wearing out or needing to be done before the next weather came in. And Harvey, who had grown up in a blacksmith's household and understood tools and labor, threw himself into it with a focus that might have looked, to a casual observer, like a man trying to outrun something. Which was, Ella eventually concluded, at least partially accurate. She watched him the way she watched everything on the farm, with the careful, evaluating attention of someone who understands that small things accumulate into large consequences, that a small crack in a water trough becomes a flood, and a small loose bolt in a wagon axle becomes a wreck. She watched him and she took inventory of what she found. He was quiet in a way that was not sullen. He was careful in a way that was not timid. He had a specific way of stopping what he was doing and going still when something surprised him, like a held breath, like a man recalibrating. And she had noticed it enough times to understand that it was not a fear response, but something more like an instinct toward accuracy, toward understanding a thing correctly before he responded to it. He did not try to explain himself further after that first night. He did not offer more of his history or ask her to revise her understanding of him. He seemed to accept that what she thought of him was entirely her right to determine, and that the only thing he could offer in evidence was what she could see for herself. She found this maddening and admirable in equal measure. On the fourth day, when she was in the kitchen making bread and he was somewhere out behind the barn, she took the watch out of the drawer where she had put it after that first supper and held it in her hand. She listened to it tick. She thought about her father, who had been a good man with a practical heart and a soldier's stubbornness, and she thought about what he would have said about the situation she was currently in. He would have said something useful and infuriating, she decided. He would have said, "You can judge a man by who he was and you can judge a man by who he is trying to be, and there is an argument to be made for each, but the only argument that matters in the long run is which of those two things he brings with him into the next 10 years. She put the watch back in the drawer. On the sixth day, something shifted. It happened over a stupid thing, the way the important things often do. Harvey was repairing the roof of the chicken coop, which had developed a leak over the summer, and Ella brought him water, which was practical and not romantic. And when she handed it up to him on the ladder, he reached for the cup and their fingers touched for a moment. Just a moment. Nothing more than accidental contact on a clay cup, and they both went still. The stillness lasted exactly as long as it needed to mean something, and then Ella stepped back and Harvey drank the water and they went back to their respective tasks. But the air between them had changed in a way that neither of them could have described precisely, and that both of them spent the rest of the afternoon and evening thinking about in the silences of their separate spaces. That night at supper, something was different. The quiet between them had a different quality, a warmer quality, a quality that Ella recognized from reading and from listening to other people describe their lives, and that she had not expected to encounter inside her own kitchen. "Tell me about Missouri," she said. He looked at her across the table. "Why?" "Because I know the version of your life that exists on a wanted poster," she said, "and I'd like to know something about the version that existed before it." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might deflect, might redirect, might do any of the things that people do when they do not want to be known. But he did not. He set down his fork and he told her about Missouri. He told her about his father's forge, and the specific smell of hot iron and coal smoke that he associated with childhood, the way the heat would radiate out into the winter cold like something alive. He told her about learning to shoe horses before he was 12 and about the satisfaction of a job done correctly, of metal shaped into something useful. He told her about his older brother, Thomas, who had died in the Indian Wars in 1876, and the way that loss had untethered him in ways he had not understood until much later. He told her about the first bad decision, and the second, and the way that bad decisions accumulate not like separate things but like a current, the way that each one narrows the range of available choices for the next one, until you look up one day and you are so far from where you started that you cannot see the shore. He did not say any of this as an excuse. He said it as an account, a statement of the facts of a particular life as it had actually occurred, and Ella listened with the same careful, evaluating attention she brought to everything, and she found that what she felt, listening to him, was not primarily judgment. What she felt was recognition. Not of the specific circumstances, because her circumstances had been entirely different, but of the deeper thing, the experience of a life that had not gone the way it was supposed to go, and the daily work of deciding what to do with the version of yourself that remained after the plans fell apart. "My mother died when I was 11, she said, when he finished. "And after that I think my father and I both had to learn how to be different people than we'd expected to be." "How did you do that?" Harvey asked, and he asked it with a directness and a genuine interest that she found privately almost startling. "Badly at first," she said, "then better, the same way everyone does, I suppose." He smiled. The full version of the smile this time, not the caught-before-it-formed version from that first supper. It changed his face considerably. It made him look younger and more open, and like a person who had not always been carrying what he was clearly carrying. She looked at that smile and felt the warm quality in the air between them get warmer, and she thought, I am in trouble. She thought it without alarm, which surprised her. She thought it the way you think about whether you can see coming but can't do anything about, with a kind of practical acknowledgement that things are about to change. On the 8th day, Ella rode into redemption. She needed supplies: flour, salt, lamp oil, and she went alone, as she always did, with the wagon and the older of the 2 horses. She did not tell Harvey she was going, because there was no reason to, and yet she was aware as she drove down the long flat road toward town that she was also aware of his absence from the farm behind her in a way she had not been aware of it 2 weeks ago. In redemption, she bought her supplies from the general store, which was run by a man named Aldous Webb, who had a particular talent for making ordinary transactions feel like interrogations. Heard you got a man working your farm, Aldous said, wrapping her flour in brown paper. Ella looked at him steadily. Word travels, she said. It does in small towns, Aldous agreed pleasantly. Don't suppose you know his name. Gave his name as Tom, Ella said, which was a lie she had prepared on the road in and delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who had grown up with a father who believed that lying was occasionally the most practical choice available. He's a drifter looking for seasonal work. Does good repairs. Is that right? Said Aldous, and he said it in the way that people say things when they are not entirely satisfied with the answer, but cannot press further without revealing the limits of what they actually know. Ella paid for her supplies and drove back home, and on the road she thought about what she had done, which was to lie for Harvey Ashford to a town gossip, which was the kind of action that committed you to a position in ways that were difficult to walk back. She thought about why she had done it. She did not come to a simple answer. She came to several complex ones, none of which she was ready to say out loud. When she got back to the farm, Harvey was on the roof of the barn, replacing a section of shingles that had lifted in a recent windstorm. She could see him from the road, moving methodically across the slope of the roof with the easy balance of a man who was comfortable at height. He saw her come in with the wagon and he raised a hand, and she raised a hand back, and it was completely ordinary and completely unremarkable, and she felt something warm in her chest that she had learned by now to stop being surprised about. That evening, after supper, they sat on the porch. This was new. They had been eating supper inside and then retiring to their separate spaces, her to the house, him to the loft. But this particular evening, Ella had poured 2 cups of coffee and had come out to the porch and sat in one of the 2 chairs there, and Harvey had come out of the barn to check something on the wagon and had found her there, and she had not offered him the other chair, and so he had sat. The evening was the kind of Texas evening that almost made you forgive the summer, still warm but with a breath in it, the sky going from gold to orange to a deep purple that was almost violent in its beauty, and the first stars coming out over the flat horizon. I lied for you today in town, Ella said. She had decided that the direct approach was the right one. It was always the right one with her, and she had no reason to change her approach for this man. Harvey looked at her. I didn't ask you to do that. No, she agreed. You didn't. Why did you? She looked at the sky. I haven't decided yet what I think about who you are now, she said, and I don't want a man with a badge deciding for me before I've had the chance. And if you decide you don't trust me, then I'll send for the marshal myself, she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. That's fair, he said. It is, she agreed. She sipped her coffee. I want you to know that the watch is not why I'm making this choice. The watch is not debt. You don't owe me anything for returning it, and I don't owe you anything because of it. I know, Harvey said. I didn't return it to buy anything. Good, Ella said, because I don't buy and I don't sell when it comes to the things that matter. He turned to look at her fully then, and in the last light of the evening she could see that his expression was the open one, the one that was not guarded, and she thought about the first time she had seen him, the gun leveled at his chest, the watch in his hand, and how much had changed in 8 days in ways that she had not predicted and could not entirely explain. Ella, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name. She had not told him to use it. He had taken the cue from somewhere else, from the gradual accumulation of familiarity that had been building between them, whether either of them had intended it or not. "Harvey," she said back, and there was something almost like humor in the way she said it, a kind of mutual acknowledgement of what was happening between them. They sat on the porch until the stars were fully out and the coffee was cold, talking. About practical things at first, the state of the fence lines, the prospects for the fall crops, the condition of the wagon's front axle, which needed attention. And then about less practical things, and then about things that were not practical at all, things that people only talk about in the dark when the formalities of daylight have receded, things about loss and hope, and what a person is willing to forgive in themselves and in others. Harvey told her about the federal mail robbery in Tucson, which she had asked him about directly. He told her what had happened and what he had done and what he was not proud of, and he did not minimize it, and she appreciated that more than any amount of justification would have cost her. "The law sees one thing when it looks at me," he said, "and I'm not asking you to see something different just because I want you to." "What are you asking me?" Ella said. He was quiet for a long moment. The night sounds of the farm moved around them, the horses in the barn, the creek a quarter-mile out, an owl somewhere in the dark. "I'm not sure yet," he said honestly. "But I think I'm getting closer to knowing." She did not push it. She understood the value of not pushing things before they were ready. On the 10th day, Harvey received a visitor at the farm. He was at the creek fixing the diversion ditch when he heard the horse, and some instinct he had developed over 4 years with the Coburn gang made him step back into the shadow of the willow trees before the rider came over the ridge. He watched the rider approach the farmhouse, and he recognized from the horse and from the easy, dangerous carriage of the man in the saddle exactly who it was: Billy Rourke. Dale Coburn's right hand, the man who delivered messages and enforced promises, the man Harvey had been most afraid of finding on his trail when he left the gang 3 weeks ago. Ella came out onto the porch. Harvey was already moving, coming up fast through the scrub brush along the creek bed, circling wide to come around the back of the house. He could hear the conversation from 30 feet away. "I'm looking for a man named Harvey Ashford," Billy Rourke said. He had a pleasant voice, which Harvey had always found to be the most unsettling thing about him. "Word is he may have come through this way." "I don't know that name," Ella said. Her voice was level. Harvey, crouching behind the corner of the house, felt a complicated mix of gratitude and alarm. "He's about this tall," Billy said, and described Harvey with the unhurried accuracy of a man who had been looking for someone long enough to memorize them. "He rode with the Coburn gang before he decided to have second thoughts about his loyalties." "Lots of men pass through," Ella said. "Can't keep track of all of them." "This one you'd remember," Billy said pleasantly. "He's got a particular look to him. And he's carrying something that doesn't belong to him." Harvey stepped around the corner of the house with his hand on his revolver. "He returned it," Harvey said. Billy Rourke turned in his saddle with the careful, controlled movement of a man who was very good at not being startled. He looked at Harvey with the expression of a cat who has located the specific thing it has been looking for. "There he is," Billy said. "Ride out, Billy," Harvey said. "I'm not part of the gang. Whatever Dale wants, he's got no claim on me." "Dale says different." Billy's hand was resting near his own gun in a casual way that was not casual at all. "Says you left with property that wasn't yours." "The watch was not Coburn's property," Harvey said. "The watch belonged to this woman's father, who your man killed for it." Billy's eyes moved to Ella, assessing. "That's an unfortunate situation," he said, in a tone that indicated he found it neither unfortunate nor particularly interesting. "Ride out," Harvey said again. "Tell Dale I'm done. Tell him the watch is returned and there's nothing here that belongs to him and I've got no interest in his business or his problems." Billy Rourke smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Dale's going to want to hear that from you directly," he said. "Then Dale knows where to find me," Harvey said. Something shifted in Billy's expression then, a kind of recalibration. He looked at Harvey standing at the corner of the farmhouse with his hand on his gun, and he looked at the farmhouse itself, and at the farm spread out around it, and at Ella Norris standing on the porch, and he seemed to be reading a story in all of these elements. "Well," Billy said finally, "I'll tell him." He touched the brim of his hat toward Ella with a politeness that was more threatening than any open hostility. "Ma'am." Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Harvey and Ella stood and watched until the rider was gone over the ridge and the dust had settled. "That was a mistake," Harvey said quietly. "Which part?" Ella said, "telling him where I am." Would he not have found out anyway? Harvey thought about it honestly. "Probably," he admitted. "Then it was not the mistake," Ella said. "Come inside." Inside, at the kitchen table, Ella looked at Harvey with the clear-eyed assessment that he had come to associate with her when she was doing her most direct thinking. "How dangerous is this man?" she asked. "Coburn or Rourke?" "Both," Harvey considered. "Coburn is dangerous because he's smart and because he has no limits. Rourke is dangerous because he does exactly what Coburn tells him to, and he is very good at it. How long do we have?" He noted the "we" and did not make a thing of it, but he noted it. "Days, maybe. Coburn will want to move fast before I can get to a marshal." "Then we should get to a marshal first," Ella said. Harvey looked at her. "If I go to a marshal, I'm not coming back," he said plainly. "There are outstanding warrants on me. I'd be lucky to end up in a territorial prison and not at the end of a rope." Ella was quiet. She was thinking. He could see her thinking, the particular focus that came over her face when she was working through a problem to its actual structure rather than its surface. "There is a U.S. Marshal named Harding out of El Paso," she said. "He came through last spring looking for a different man, and he talked to my father. My father said he was a fair man. Not just a man who valued order, but one who distinguished between types of crime and types of criminal." "One man's word about a marshal," Harvey said. "My father was a good judge of people," Ella said, "and there was a finality in it that was not argument but fact. I'd trust his read." Harvey looked at his hands on the table. He was thinking about everything the word marshal represented, the end of this particular borrowed time, the accounting for everything he had done and not done, the way that doing the right thing at this point would not cancel the wrong things that had come before it. He was thinking about the possibility of prison and the possibility of something worse than prison. He was thinking about the farm, about the mornings by the creek, about coffee on the porch in the evening dark, about Ella. "If I turn myself in," he said, "and if a fair marshal allows for it, if there's any path at all to something other than a cell or a gallows, I want to come back here." Ella looked at him. The look was very still and very clear, the way water in a deep well is still and clear. "Then you had better make sure that there is a path," she said. "Because I am not going to wait for a man who is not coming back, and I am not going to hope for something that does not have a reasonable chance of being true. But if there is a real chance, Harvey Ashford, if there is an honest chance, then I would like very much for you to take it." It was the most she had said directly about what was between them. It was not a declaration. It was a practical woman establishing the conditions under which she was willing to hope, which was, Harvey thought, in some ways more moving than any declaration could have been. "I need 2 days to prepare," he said, "and I need to know that you'll be safe here while I'm gone." "I've been safe here alone for a long time," Ella said. "Not with Coburn on his way," she considered. "My neighbor Cleet Parsons owes my father about 4 years' worth of goodwill," she said. "He has a wife and 2 grown sons, and they are all armed. I'll send word." "Good," Harvey said. He looked at her across the table and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything else about it, because sometimes the most important things have been said and the only honest response is to let them sit in the room until they find their proper shape. On the 11th day, Harvey rode out toward El Paso. He rode with a letter that Ella had written and sealed with wax, a letter to Marshal Harding that laid out the facts of the Coburn gang, the movements she had observed, the location of the man who called himself Billy Rourke, and Harvey Ashford's willingness to provide full testimony in exchange for a consideration of his circumstances. She had written it with the careful, precise language of someone who understood that this document might matter considerably. She had given it to him without ceremony. She had also, at the last moment, pressed her hand briefly against the back of his, standing by his horse in the early morning, just for a moment, just long enough to mean something. He had looked at her hand and then at her face, and he had said, "I will come back. Come back because it is the right thing," she said, "and because it is what you want, not for me." "All three of those things are true," Harvey said. She had stepped back then and watched him ride out, and she had gone back to the work of the farm because that was what you did when you were Ella Norris. You went back to the work. But she kept the watch on the kitchen table while he was gone, where she could hear it ticking while she moved through the house, and she thought about time and about the ways in which the future was and was not predictable, and about her father, who had been a good judge of people, and about whether she herself was. The days that followed were not idle ones. Cleet Parsons came with his 2 sons as promised, and his wife Martha, who was a practical and unsentimental woman who reminded Ella of herself 20 years hence, which she found both comforting and slightly unnerving. They stayed in the barn, armed and present, and on the second night, Dale Coburn arrived. He came with 4 men, in the dark, which was exactly when Harvey had predicted he would come, and there was a tense and frightening 20 minutes in which the Parsons boys and Dale Coburn's men exchanged a conversation of raised voices and brandished weapons across the yard, and Ella stood in the doorway of the house with her shotgun and her expression, and declined to be moved. Dale Coburn was a lean man in his 40s with eyes that sat too close together, and a voice that was flat and mean like the sound of a gate hinge that needed oil. He told Ella things about Harvey that were designed to damage her trust in him, true things mixed with lies in a proportion calibrated to be maximally destructive. "He was with us when that mail train was robbed," Coburn said. "He wasn't just a rider, he helped plan it." "I already know his history," Ella said. "Why are you here? I want what he took when he left." "He took a watch," Ella said, "and he returned it to its rightful owner. There is nothing else here that belongs to you." Coburn looked at her with those too close eyes. "He's not coming back," he said. "Whatever he told you, men like Ashford don't get to walk out of one life and into another. The rope catches up." "You may be right," Ella said, "but that is between Harvey Ashford and the law, and it is none of your business. Get off my land, Mr. Coburn. There are 4 armed men behind you, and I am capable of shooting both barrels of this gun before you could clear your holster." Dale Coburn looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, which was more frightening than the not smiling had been. "You're a hard woman," he said. "My father raised me practical," she said. He rode out. His men rode with him. Cleet Parsons afterward said that in 40 years of living in Texas, he had never seen anything like it. And his wife Martha said she had, and it was called survival. Harvey Ashford arrived back at the Norris farm on the 14th day. He arrived in the afternoon, riding a different horse than the one he had left on, and with a man beside him that Ella recognized after a moment as a figure of authority, a tall man in his 50s with the specific carriage and the specific unremarkable hat, and the specific everything that designated a U.S. Marshal as clearly as any badge. Ella came out onto the porch. Harvey got down from his horse. He looked tired in a specific way that was different from the travel-tired way he had looked on the very first day. This was something deeper, something that came from a long and serious series of conversations about the nature of his past and the range of his possible futures. "Ella," he said, "this is Marshal Harding out of El Paso." Marshal Harding removed his hat. He was, as her father had apparently judged him, a man with a face that suggested he had thought seriously about fairness. "Miss Norris." "I've read your letter. I appreciate you writing it. Did it help?" Ella asked. "It did," Harding said. "Mr. Ashford has been forthcoming about everything, and his testimony is going to be of significant use to us in pursuing the Coburn gang. The gang is the bigger criminal enterprise here, and the law has an interest in prioritizing accordingly." Ella looked at Harvey, and Harvey looked back at her. "There are conditions," he said. "I'll face a hearing in El Paso in 6 weeks. I may face a fine or a period of community service with Marshal Harding's oversight. The mail train robbery carries a charge that isn't going to disappear entirely." He paused, But there is a real path, a real one. What does that mean for the immediate time? Ella asked. It means that Mr. Ashford is required to remain in a settled location and check in regularly with the marshal's office, Harding said. It means he is not a free man in all respects, but it means he is not in a cell. Ella was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Marshal Harding. Will redemption satisfy as a settled location? She asked. Harding looked between her and Harvey and then back at her with the expression of a man who was reading a situation accurately. It would, he said. Then I believe we can accommodate that, Ella said. Harvey was looking at her with an expression that she had not seen on his face before. It was something open and overwhelming and carefully contained, like a thing that was too large for the moment it occupied but that was being patient about it. Ella, he said. Marshal, Ella said, addressing Harding while keeping her eyes on Harvey, would you like to come in for coffee before you ride back? I would appreciate that, ma'am, the marshal said. Harvey, Ella said, now looking directly at him, will you bring in those supply bags from the saddle? The kitchen needs replenishing. And Harvey Ashford, who had been an outlaw and a fugitive and a man with no fixed location in the world, picked up the supply bags and walked into Ella Norris's kitchen, and something in the way he crossed that threshold was different from the first time. He crossed it as if he belonged there. As if belonging there was a thing he was still getting used to, still slightly amazed by, but certain of nonetheless. Over coffee, Marshal Harding explained the terms more fully and left Harvey with a document to sign, which he signed at the kitchen table with Ella beside him and the pocket watch between them. Harding rode out as the late afternoon sun was flattening toward the horizon. He shook Harvey's hand at the gate and told him that a man who made good choices consistently over time eventually became a man who had made good choices, and that this was not without value under the law or under any other standard. After he rode out, Harvey and Ella stood by the gate in the falling light, and the air around them had the particular quality of a season changing, something finishing, something else beginning. You came back, Ella said. I told you I would. You said it was the right thing and what you wanted, she said, both together. They were the same thing, he said. They are the same thing. She looked at him. The watch was in her hand. She had been carrying it out from the kitchen without thinking about it, the way you carry things that have become familiar. She looked at the watch and then at Harvey, and she thought about her father and about endings and beginnings and about the very long, improbable chain of events that had brought an outlaw to her door with a dead man's timepiece. I think, she said carefully, that you should keep working on the barn roof. The north section is still showing weather. He looked at her. A beat of quiet, then the smile, the full one, the open one, the one that changed his face. Yes, ma'am, he said. And I think supper tonight should be something better than corn mush, she said. I have a chicken that's been getting above herself lately, and I believe her time has come. That's a practical approach, Harvey agreed. I'm a practical woman, Ella said. She turned back toward the house, and Harvey walked beside her, and the evening settled over the farm like something decided. The weeks that followed were not simple, but they were good in the way that things are good when they are built honestly rather than pretended into existence. Harvey went to El Paso for his hearing 6 weeks later, and Ella drove him to the stage depot herself and watched him board without ceremony, because ceremony was not the language they spoke. And when he came back 10 days after that, with a formal record of his conditions, a financial judgment that he had partially paid and would pay the rest over time, and a document that constituted, in the language of 1882 Texas law, a provisional clearance. She was standing at the depot when the stage came in. She had not told him she would be there. She had simply been there because it was where she needed to be. He came down the steps of the stage and saw her and stopped. She looked at him. How did it go? She asked. About as well as it could have, he said. Better than I deserved, probably. Better than you deserved at 20, she said. Not necessarily at 28, he looked at her. You know how old I am. You mentioned it, she said, in passing. I didn't think you retained it. I retain most things, she said. It's a habit, he smiled. She smiled back, And it was not the near smile from the first night or the complicated smile from the porch or the overwhelming smile from the gate. It was something simpler and more solid than all of those. The smile that happens between people who have passed through something hard together and arrived at something good. He put his bag in the wagon and climbed up beside her on the seat, and she handed him the reins because his hands were better on the horses than hers and they both knew it. And they drove back to the farm in the late afternoon with the land flat and golden on all sides and the sky enormous above them. "I want to ask you something," Harvey said when they were halfway home. "Then ask it," Ella said. "I want to ask you properly. I want to ask you when I have a house that's mine and land that's mine and a life that's mine to offer, and those things are some distance in the future still, but I want you to know that I'm going to ask." Ella was quiet for a moment. The wagon moved over the road and the horses moved steadily, and the last of the afternoon light was turning everything the color of old gold. "Harvey," she said, "yes, I have a house and land and a life." She looked at him. "And I am asking you to share them, which is not the same as offering you something lesser than what you might provide for yourself one day, because what I am offering is specific and it is real and it is now, and I am not a woman who waits." He was very still beside her on the wagon seat. "Ella, I am practical about many things," she said. "I am also not blind. I know what this has been these weeks. I know what it is. And I am not asking you to offer me something in the future when what I want is something in the present. So I am asking you, will you marry me, Harvey Ashford?" The wagon rolled on. A hawk turned in slow circles in the air to the north. The creek glinted silver in the distance. "Yes," Harvey said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which was the first time she had heard it be anything other than steady, and she found this more moving than she had anticipated. "Good," she said. "That's settled then." She took the reins back from him, and he laughed, the full, unguarded laugh of a man who had forgotten for a long time that he was capable of it. And she smiled with her eyes on the road ahead and her father's watch in her pocket, ticking steadily. They were married in Redemption 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in the small frame church on Main Street, in front of the circuit preacher and Cleet Parsons and his wife Martha, and a handful of people from town who had come partly out of curiosity and partly out of the genuine human appetite for occasions that affirm that life continues and contains good things. Ella wore a blue dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit her, with her dark hair braided and pinned. Harvey wore a new coat that he had bought in El Paso with a portion of the wages he had saved, and he stood at the front of the church with the particular stillness of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be and knows it. When the preacher asked if he would take this woman, Harvey Ashford said, "I will," with a conviction that started in the chest and carried all the way to the back of the small church. And Ella Norris, who did not cry easily, felt something in her throat that she chose to acknowledge privately and set aside. After the ceremony, Martha Parsons produced a wedding cake made of dried fruit and honey, which was both practical and, under the circumstances, absolutely perfect. Cleet Parsons made a toast that referenced Robert Norris 3 times and used the phrase "good man" twice in ways that were not wrong, and the afternoon was warm and golden and entirely sufficient. That night in the house that was now theirs together, Harvey and Ella sat on the porch in the 2 chairs and watched the stars come out over the Pecos Basin, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence, because the silence was full already. Harvey put the watch on the porch railing between them where they could both see it in the starlight. "I've been thinking," he said after a while. "About what?" "About the farm, about what it could be." He was looking out at the dark land. "I was talking to a man in El Paso about a cattle operation. The grazing land along the South Creek is better than anything within 50 miles. If we added to the herd—" "I've been thinking the same thing," Ella said. "For about a year, actually. The fence work would need to be significant." "I'm good at fence work," Harvey said. "You are," she agreed. "And I have a few ideas about the water situation along the north end," he said. If we extended your father's diversion ditch, show me, Ella said. He looked at her. Now, in the morning, she said. Show me in the morning, walk me through it. He smiled. In the morning, he agreed. They sat in comfortable silence. The stars turned slowly. An owl called from somewhere near the barn. Harvey, Ella said, thank you for riding 3 days to return my father's watch. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you for asking me to stay for supper, he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them the watch ticked its steady, quiet rhythm, and the night was warm, and the land was their land, and what they had made of the broken and unexpected material of their 2 lives was solid and real and full of future. In the months that followed, they built what they had talked about on that porch. Harvey's knowledge of horses and iron and practical construction proved as valuable on the farm as Ella had suspected it would, and he had a natural instinct for the cattle operation that surprised even him. A patience with the animals and a working intelligence about the land that felt, he thought sometimes, like the first thing in his adult life that had emerged entirely naturally rather than being imposed by circumstance. Ella expanded the kitchen garden and began selling produce to the general store in Redemption on a reliable basis, which became a source of income that grew steadily, and which Aldous Webb, who had continued to be faintly suspicious of Harvey for about 6 months before he gave it up, came to rely on in a way that required him to be civil. They hired a hand named Pedro Vasquez, who was 18 and from a family in the area that had worked cattle land for 2 generations before that land had been increasingly taken from them, and who was clever and hardworking, and who arrived with a directness of manner that reminded Ella of herself and Harvey both, which she took as a good sign. Pedro ate supper with them most nights and became, without any formal declaration, a member of the household, and Harvey taught him what he knew about horses and ironwork, and Pedro taught Harvey things about the land that his family had been learning for longer than Harvey's family had been in the country. The Coburn gang was brought in by Marshal Harding, and a team of deputies 8 months after Harvey's testimony, following a series of coordinated arrests that took place over 3 days in 2 counties. Dale Coburn was tried and convicted in El Paso in 1883, and Billy Rourke received the same. Harvey testified at the trial, which required 2 difficult days in El Paso during which Ella ran the farm alone without complaint, and which Harvey returned from looking as if something long and heavy had been finally set down. He did not talk much about the trial that first night back. He ate supper and sat on the porch, and Ella sat beside him and let the silence do what it needed to do, and in the morning he was more himself, and over the next several days he gradually told her the pieces of it, and she listened with her complete attention, and the telling of it was its own kind of processing, the kind that required a good listener more than a solution. "It's done," he said on the 4th night after his return. "Properly done, the whole of it." "Yes," Ella agreed. He looked at the watch on the table between them. He reached out and picked it up and turned it in his hand, the RN engraved on the back catching the lamplight. "I think about him," Harvey said. "Your father, I think about what I did and didn't do, and I think about who he was." "I know," Ella said. "I'm sorry for it. I know I've said that before." "You have. And I have believed you every time. I want to be the kind of man he'd have thought was right for you," Harvey said. "I'm not sure I'm there yet." Ella looked at him. "My father," she said, "was a practical man. He judged people by what they did with what they had and what they did when the situation required something. He judged people by whether they could be honest when it cost them something." She paused. "He would have liked you. I am certain of it." Harvey looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not the smile and not the open expression, but something deeper than both, something that did not need any particular name. "I would have liked him," Harvey said. "Yes," Ella said. "You would have." She reached across and put her hand over his on the watch, and they stayed that way for a while in the lamplight, and the night was quiet around them, and the farm was good. Ella discovered she was pregnant in the spring of 1883. She told Harvey on a Tuesday morning, at the breakfast table, in the matter-of-fact way she told him things, directly and without theatrical preparation, setting the information in front of him the same way she set his plate down. She watched his face. The sequence of expressions that moved across Harvey Ashford's face in the 5 seconds following this announcement was, Ella thought, possibly the most interesting thing she had ever seen in her life. There was surprise, and then something that was not quite ready yet, and then something that was more than ready, and then something that was so open and unguarded and raw that it took her breath slightly. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her face in his hands and looked at her with those gray-green eyes at a distance of about 6 inches, and she looked back at him. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am not a woman who reports uncertain things," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, and then he pressed his forehead to hers, and she put her hands over his, and they stayed like that in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the coffee going cold on the stove and the watch ticking on its shelf. "A child," Harvey said, and the word in his mouth had a quality of wonder that she had not heard there before. "We have approximately 7 months to prepare," Ella said, "which should be sufficient." "I want to build a proper room," he said immediately. "The east end of the house, I've been thinking about expanding in that direction anyway. The structure will support it." "Harvey," Ella said. "Yes. Sit down and finish your breakfast first." He sat down. He did not finish his breakfast. He ate about 3 bites and then got up again and went outside, and Ella heard, shortly afterward, the sound of him explaining to Pedro that they were going to need more lumber, with an urgency that was entirely disproportionate to the actual timeline involved. She smiled at her coffee and drank it and thought about the particular texture of a life that had not gone the way anyone planned, and that was, for that reason, more fully itself than any planned life could have been. The boy was born in November of 1883, and they named him Robert James Ashford Robert for Ella's father, and James for Harvey's father, whose name had been James, and who had been, Harvey said, a better man than Harvey had been for a long time, but a man who might have recognized where his son had arrived at in the end. Robert was born in the farmhouse, with Martha Parsons present as midwife, in a long and difficult labor that Harvey spent primarily outside with Pedro because Ella had told him firmly that his being inside would not help anything and would only give him something to worry about, and he was already at his theoretical maximum for worry. When Martha Parsons opened the door and told him he could come in, Harvey crossed the threshold into the room where Ella was lying in the bed looking exhausted and entire and absolutely herself, with a wrapped bundle in her arms, and Harvey went to his knees beside the bed without planning to, and he looked at his son, this new person, this small, complete, particular face, and he felt something that was entirely new in the catalog of things he had felt in his life. "He's here," Ella said. "He is," Harvey said. "He could not do much more than that." "He has your eyes," Ella said, "or something close to them." Harvey looked at his son and thought about all the versions of himself that had existed before this moment, and about the long, improbable chain of consequences and choices that had led here, and about a watch ticking in a man's hand on a farmhouse porch, and about a woman with a shotgun who had not fired it. And he thought that the universe was indifferent to human beings, but that human beings occasionally, through some combination of choice and courage and accident, managed to make something worth having out of the indifference. "Hello, Robert," he said softly. Robert, being 11 minutes old, had no particular response, but he turned his head slightly in the direction of Harvey's voice, and Harvey took this as a favorable sign. The years that followed layered themselves onto the Norris Ashford farm like good seasons, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary and sometimes extraordinary sorrows that Texas in the 1880s distributed without favor, but full and growing and alive. The cattle operation grew steadily, and within 3 years they had a herd that was one of the better managed in the county, and Harvey's reputation as a man who was good with horses spread through the area in ways that brought work and a modest prosperity. The farm was not wealthy in any grand sense, but it was sufficient, and sufficiency was not a word that either of them applied with any smallness. It meant enough. And enough was what they had built, and they had built it together. They had a second child in 1886, a girl they named Maria after Ella's mother, who had the dark hair of her Castillo grandmother, and who by the age of 2 had demonstrated a directness of manner that made Harvey say with pride that she was entirely Ella's daughter. Robert grew up in the particular way of a child who has been wanted and valued, and set to work early on meaningful things, curious and capable, and with his father's instinct for accuracy and his mother's instinct for directness, which was a combination that occasionally made him difficult and more often made him interesting. Pedro Vasquez stayed on as their primary hired hand for a decade, and eventually bought his own small parcel of land 2 miles east of the Norris farm, with Harvey's help and Ella's connections in town, a transaction that took 2 years of careful navigation of the legal and financial systems of 1880s Texas, systems that were not designed with Pedro's interests in mind, but which had. In this particular instance, and with considerable effort and the advocacy of a U.S. Marshal who had come to consider Harvey Ashford a trustworthy source of information about local matters, eventually produced the right outcome. The watch lived on the kitchen shelf. Ella wound it every morning the same as her father had. She did it without making a ceremony of it, the same way she did everything practically and as a matter of course. But Harvey noticed it every time, and he understood what it meant. And one morning, early in 1888, when Robert was 4 and Maria was almost 2 and the farm was in its settled, productive years, he watched Ella wind the watch at the kitchen table and he said, "Tell me about him." Ella looked up. "Your father," Harvey said. "Tell me more about him. Robert's going to want to know eventually." Ella looked at the watch in her hand. She sat down at the table, and Harvey sat across from her, and she began to talk about Robert Norris. She talked about his arrival from Tennessee with 2 mules and a Bible. She talked about his hands, which were large and capable and never entirely clean. She talked about the fence lines he had built, and the ditch he had dug, and the evenings he had spent reading almanacs by lamplight. She talked about the way he had taught her to approach problems, not as fixed obstacles but as things that had a logic to them, a logic that, if you studied it long enough, would reveal a solution. She talked about how he had loved her mother, and how that love had defined the shape of his grief, and how the grief had not diminished him but had made him quieter and more careful in the way that things are quiet and careful when they hold something precious. Harvey listened. He listened the way he had always listened to her, with complete attention and without interruption, and when she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand. "He was a good man," Harvey said. "He was," Ella agreed. "He is." "The watch is still ticking." Harvey looked at her hand in his and then at her face, and what he felt in that moment was the thing that he had been feeling, in its various forms, since that first morning at the creek when the sun had not yet risen, and she had come walking toward him with 2 buckets and her complete, unsentimental self. It was love. Plainly and entirely that. Not the frantic or desperate version of it that people write poems about and that burns fast. The settled, certain, daily version. The kind that is built rather than found, that accumulates like the good seasons on the farm, that is renewed each morning in the practical and gentle acts of 2 people choosing each other continuously. "I love you," Harvey said. He did not say it for the first time in that moment. There had been other moments, quieter ones that had emerged naturally from the specific closeness of their particular life. But he said it in that moment because she had just given him something true about herself and her history, and the response that was truest and most adequate was that. "I know," Ella said. She pressed her hand against his. "I love you." They sat in the kitchen with the morning coming in and the watch ticking, and the sounds of Robert waking up in the east room and the coffee starting to smell of itself, and the whole of it. The farm, the watch, the children, the particular man across the table from her, the particular life that had emerged from a shotgun on a porch and a bowl of corn mush, and a decision not to fire settled around Ella Norris like something she had always known was coming, even when she had not known it was coming at all. In 1889, Marshal Harding came through redemption on a case and stopped at the farm for supper, as he had done 3 or 4 times in the years since Harvey's hearing, and he ate at the Ashford table with Robert on one side of him and Maria on the other and Harvey and Ella across from him, and he looked around the table with the expression of a man who has occasionally seen things come out right. "You've done well," he said to Harvey. "We've done well," Harvey said, and he looked at Ella when he said it. "The provisional status has been formally closed," Harding said. "Came through last month. There's nothing outstanding. You're a free man in every legal sense of the word." Harvey was quiet for a moment. He had known this was coming, the paperwork had been moving in that direction for over a year, but hearing it said plainly at his own table with his family around him was a different thing from knowing it abstractly. "Thank you," Harvey said, "for the fairness." "You earned it," Harding said. "The testimony on Coburn alone was worth more than most men offer in a lifetime." "My father-in-law was killed," Harvey said. "That seemed like a minimum." Robert, who was 5, looked up from his supper with the particular attention of a child who has noticed that the adults are talking about something important. "Who is Coburn?" he asked. "A man who made very bad choices," Ella said, "and was held accountable for them." "Like in the Bible," Robert said. "Somewhat," Ella agreed. "Did he go to prison?" "He did." Robert considered this with the solemn satisfaction of a 5-year-old who finds justice comprehensible and appropriate. "Good," he said, and went back to his supper. Harding laughed. Ella smiled. Harvey looked at his son and felt the uncomplicated, specific rightness of the moment, and thought that this was what a life was, actually. Not the large events, but the small ones. The supper table and the child's question and the watch on the shelf, and the woman across the table who had looked at a man on her porch with a gun in her hand and decided, against all reasonable odds, that he was worth knowing. After supper, after Harding had ridden out and Robert and Maria were in bed and the house was quiet, Harvey and Ella sat on the porch in the 2 chairs, the same 2 chairs that had been on the porch since the beginning, repaired twice but unchanged in their essential nature, and watched the stars come out over the Pecos Basin. Harvey was holding the watch. He had picked it up from the shelf as they came out, not for any particular reason, just the way you carry familiar things. 7 years, Ella said. "Since the day you came to the door with the gun." "Since the day you came to the door with the watch," he corrected. "Same day," she said. "Different perspectives," he agreed. She looked at him. He was older, and the life showed in him the way good lives show in people, in the set of his face and the steadiness of his hands, and the way he moved through the world with a deliberateness that was not caution but conviction. He had grown into the version of himself that Harvey Ashford at 20 had no way of knowing existed, and she had been there for the growing, and this was one of the specific privileges of a life shared honestly with another person. "Give me the watch," she said. He handed it to her. She turned it in her hand, the RN engraved on the back glinting in the starlight. "My father would have liked the life we've made," she said. "You said that before," Harvey said. "I say it because it's true," she said, "and because some true things are worth saying more than once." He reached over and took her hand, the watch between their joined palms ticking its steady rhythm. "7 years ago," Harvey said, "I rode 3 days across the desert to return a dead man's watch. I thought I was doing a single thing and then I would go back to having no particular place in the world. And instead," Ella said, he looked at her. At her face in the starlight, the face that he had been looking at every day for 7 years, and that continued to be exactly itself, entirely itself, unchanged in its essential precision and directness by the passage of seasons or children or difficulty or the long continuous work of building a life. "And instead," he said, "you asked me to stay for supper." "And you never left," Ella said. "No," Harvey said, "I never left." The stars turned. The night was warm. The watch ticked between their hands, keeping its faithful, patient time, and across the farm the horses stood quiet in the barn, and the cattle moved in the south pasture, and the creek ran in the dark over its stones, and everything that had been built was solid and present and theirs. Ella Norris leaned her head against Harvey Ashford's shoulder, and he turned his face toward her hair, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else, because everything that needed to be said had been said over 7 years of suppers and mornings and difficult days and good ones. And what remained was not words but life itself, moving forward steadily and without apology, like a watch wound each morning, and trusted to keep its own excellent, irreplaceable time.